everybody, to the Captain's Spot. I'm your host, Justin Freeman. 6 foot 1 inches, 275 pounds of fantasy knowledge. And it is Sunday Night Football Week 5 edition here at the Captain's Spot, where we are talking about the Minnesota Vikings traveling to Seattle, taking on Russ Wilson and the Seahawks. This game looks to be absolutely bananas. We're talking about a 57-point total. The Seahawks favored by 7, so we're going to get some really cool game script to break down. But before we hop into the game, a reminder, this show available, YouTube, podcast platform, find it wherever you'd like, but make sure you are clicking subscribe. Make sure you hit a like button. Make sure you drop a 5-star rating and review wherever you are finding this content. But without further ado, let's hop right into the slate, where again, we're talking about a pretty cool opportunity here for Kirk Cousins, Dalvin Cook, and this Vikings offense to get going against, one of the most porous defenses in the league. And I think overall, if Vikings had their druthers, they would be running the football at will against this Seattle Seahawks team. But when you've got Russ Wilson on the other side of the football, just lighting the scoreboard up, and the Vikings defense has left a lot to be desired for sure on that side of the football, we're expecting this thing to absolutely shoot out. And Vegas agrees. This thing's at a 57-point total, flirting with 60. I mean, we're just seeing some really out of control totals this year. I think we've seen a lot of reasons why. We've seen a lack of holding penalties called on the offensive side of the ball. We've seen an increase in defensive pass interference calls. We're seeing drives get sustained. We're seeing defenses look a little bit rustier than the offenses in general. It's just a perfect storm brewing. Oh, add in the lack of home field advantage. Both teams are able to execute offensively for all 4 quarters without any crowd interference. And this really just adds up to a lot of offensive firepower. And one thing I really like about this slate as I look at it is, this is going to be maybe the first slate we've broke down in a week or two, thanks to the lack of injuries here on this slate, where there's a true pricing constraint. We're not going to be able to afford all the studs that exist in this game. Obviously, we're looking at both sides of the football. Why don't we go ahead and dive right into the salaries as we talk about this? Kirk Cousins, Russell Wilson, Russ is priced way up, $13,000. Now, I think that price tag on Russ is certainly worth it. Like, there's nobody playing, maybe Aaron Rodgers, playing as good a football as Russell Wilson is right this second. Certainly deserving of the $13,000 price tag on Showdown. I think you have to begin asking yourself, is there a path for Russ to not pay off the $13,000? Is he an absolute slam dunk? Or do we gain a lot of leverage in lineups that do not include Russell Wilson? And in that case, what do those lineups tend to look like? So I think, if we're talking about being tournament players, we're having to get really interesting in the way that we're approaching this particular slate, because we are going to have to save money somewhere. It'll become really evident here shortly. Cousins, $9,600 on the other side of the football, does not possess the same ceiling Russell Wilson does not possess the same floor that Russell Wilson does. But in a game where they are playing from behind constantly, this is sort of a classic streaming opportunity for a guy like Kirk Cousins up against a pretty porous defense. But it's obviously going to be Dalvin Cook as their preferred way to move the football in this offense. Dalvin Cook will cost you $10,200. Chris Carson on the other side, $7,800. And this is a game right now where we are projecting those two workhorse running backs to be really involved in this game. We have Alexander Mattison and Carlos Hyde providing backup duties, but I should say, I mentioned that we're at relatively full strength. Carlos Hyde is one of those guys who is listed questionable in this game. On the Viking side, there's only KJ Osborne listed as out. He's the only skill player of note, but on the Seattle side, we have Jamal Adams is out on this game at safety. I usually don't talk a whole lot about defense, but Jamal Adams, super important player. And Carlos Hyde at running back still has that shoulder injury. We don't know whether or not he's going to play. He's listed as questionable in this game. So if we're not getting Carlos Hyde, we can really project an even stronger workload for Chris Carson. And Carson got all he could handle last week, exited for a brief moment in time with a concussion scare, and got checked out, cleared by the medical tent, came back in that game and resumed his large workload. I expect that to continue. Chris Carson to be rode very heavily in this game. Dalvin Cook, a guy who has some pass catching chops for sure. He can definitely stay in the game no matter which way this game script goes. In fact, you can contend if the game script goes sideways on him, he could benefit even more. But obviously, there are paths to Dalvin Cook not paying off at 10-2. Obviously, Russell Wilson a little bit safer, even though he's more expensive as we start to think about some of these really expensive options. But, if we talk about workload for Dalvin Cook and Chris Carson, they're both looking really, really strong here through the first 4 weeks of the season. Obviously, Chris Carson has had his share of getting banged up so far this year, but overall, it's been really encouraging to look at his usage. He was only on the field 56% of the snaps last week, but still managed to get 67% of the team's rush attempts, and the vast majority of the rest of it went to Russell Wilson. So, definitely like Chris Carson's role in the offense, and Dalvin Cook much the same. He is ceding a little bit of work to Alexander Mattison, but not enough to concern us. That workload split has been really favorable for Dalvin Cook. 79, 67, and 68% of the team's rush attempts over the last 3 weeks, and that's a really, really strong volume. As we look at the pass catchers, I'm sort of immediately attracted to this Seattle side, where I look at a really unique pricing decision here by DraftKings. DK Metcalf sitting at $10,000, while his teammate Tyler Lockett at $8,600. I think week in, week out, we tend to have to wonder, which is a better play in really any format between Metcalf and Lockett. Lockett seems to usually be the higher floor, more guaranteed target player. Metcalf certainly the more explosive of the two. Nobody more explosive in the NFL right this second than DK Metcalf. Nobody more efficient over the last several years than Tyler Lockett. So I think that pricing decision is interesting, and I think generally when I have two players that I deem that similar, I'm going to tend to want to have more Lockett than Metcalf, especially on a slate where the salaries are going to be really, really tightly clustered. We're going to have to really struggle to get under that $50K salary limit. Staying on the Seattle side, we saw David Moore pop off for a big game last week. He'll cost you $6,200 to get into your lineup this week. That, to me, is overpriced given what David Moore's role is in this offense. And did he play well last week? Absolutely. Did he convert on very limited opportunities? You betcha. He's only saw 12% of the team's targets, but still managed to have a monster day. What I'd prefer doing is spending down a little bit further. And one guy with some really interesting market share numbers is Greg Olsen. Greg Olsen's seen 15% and 21% of the team's targets over the last couple weeks. Add in a price tag of just $5,000, he becomes really interesting, especially if he can pay off in the red zone. I think that's usually what we're thinking in terms of tight ends. Now, Olsen is a little bit more of a middle-of-the-field type of guy, more in the line of the way Darren Waller and some of those guys. Not a true end zone threat the way that some of the larger frame tight ends are these days. But $5,000 for Greg Olsen is a fair price. Freddie Swain, a guy that we should definitely talk about, ran 43% of the snaps last week. Saw a route on 46% of Russell Wilson's dropbacks. That's plenty of usage. We can certainly roll with that. That's a better usage rate than David Moore, and you get him at, $4,800 cheaper. So Freddie Swain is definitely a guy who I'll have plenty of exposure to. Will Dissly, $600, just not getting enough run. He's been out there for around 40% of the team's snaps each and every week, but has not topped 6% of the team's targets in a single game. Obviously, if he is the unlock button that allows you to get the rest of the studs in, and he manages to catch a touchdown at $600, he'll pay off. But other than that, I think Freddie Swain is really the guy for us to zero in on here at $1,400 as far as cheap guys on the Seattle side of the football. Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson just have a complete stranglehold over the target market share on the Minnesota side. $9,800 for Adam Thielen. I think that's certainly worth a price. There's probably nobody who's guaranteed to project out for more targets in this game than Adam Thielen. Despite how much more Seattle is passing the ball than Minnesota, Thielen has such a large percentage of the team's targets, and we expect this game script to be really friendly in favor of the passing attack from Minnesota. Love him at $9,800. Think he's a really strong play. Justin Jefferson, a guy who's really come on these last 2 weeks and has maybe sort of unlocked this offense on the Minnesota side by giving them a second weapon to defend for opposing defenses. And if Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson can kind of continue to stretch defenses out horizontally and vertically, it opens things up for Dalvin Cook for sure. So I really like to see what we're seeing out of Justin Jefferson. We don't have quite enough tape on him to understand what his floor ceiling outcome looks like. And at $8,000, it'd be an interesting way to come off of Adam Thielen if you wanted to. But for now, I'm still more interested in Thielen. The tight ends in this offense, Kyle Rudolph and Irv Smith, I just don't know if they're usable. I mean, Irv Smith's $200, and you could play him for many of the same reasons that we could consider playing Will Dissly, but just super uninvolved in this offense, and I don't know how you could play either of them with any degree of confidence. Irv Smith's still out there for plenty of snaps. He's averaging 60% of the team's snaps this year. Rudolph 70%. Just the targets aren't there. Rudolph's averaged 8% of the team's targets and 9% for Irv Smith Jr. So I think overall, I think you can just X Kyle Rudolph out of the player pool, and if you want to play one of those type of guys, just save the money and go down to Irv Smith for sure. Olabisi Johnson, the guy who opened as the number 2 receiver for the Vikings, he'll cost you $1,000. He has obviously been supplanted by Justin Jefferson. His role here recently has not been as encouraging. Only played 17% of the team's snaps last week. He's getting out-snapped now by Chad Beebe. Chad Beebe will cost you $200, but another player who's not providing a ton of targets. Did not get a single target last week. So you have to ask yourself whether you can, get away with playing a guy like that. So overall, I think we are looking at super concentrated targets, especially on the Minnesota side of the football, and probably more so on the Seattle side than we saw last week. So I know it can be a little disheartening when you look at last week and you say, well, how did Penny Hart and Freddie Swain get all these targets? And David Moore, of course. And why weren't they going to DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett? I think more times than not, those targets are going to go to Metcalf and Lockett. Just, weird things happen in a small sample size of a single game. And that brings us to Showdown, where we're talking about our captain assignments. And my favorite captain for the week is Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett obviously doesn't quite line up with the conventional game plan as far as game script goes. But let's think about how game script tends to play out. We think that the Seattle Seahawks will get a lead in this game and hold it for the remainder of the game. Right? So how does Tyler Lockett line up with that game script? Well, I think you have to ask yourself, how did the Seattle Seahawks most likely get a huge lead? And I think you could say that's coming on the behalf of really, really efficient passing on behalf of Russell Wilson to those 2 top playmakers, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. On top of that, Metcalf and Lockett have a pretty significant pricing variance between the 2 of them. So by playing Lockett and the captain, we get a lot of that ceiling, plus some floor, but mostly we're concentrated on ceiling at the captain spot. We get a lot of that ceiling built into our lineup at a cheaper price. It allows us to get to some of these other guys. But behind Tyler Lockett is Chris Carson. Carson, obviously the guy who lines up most closely with the projected game script of this game, followed by Dalvin Cook, Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson, before we get to our first quarterback, Russ Wilson. So, and then DK Metcalf down there. And I think the reason Metcalf is showing up a little bit further down than you might expect at the captain spot has to do with the pricing. We're going to have to be price sensitive in this game. Looking at our flex appearances, obviously we get Russ Wilson, stands out clear and away as the optimal flex option here. We want to make sure we get him in all of our flex lineups as much as possible. But again, consider this here. Russ Wilson only appears in just shy of 60% of optimal lineups as a flex option. So there's still a really strong opportunity for Russ Wilson to not appear in a winning lineup. And there are ways that this game can go sideways. So I don't want to tell you that Russ Wilson is not going to be in the winning lineup, because he most likely will be. Just think about ways that he could fail. And do you feel comfortable with that level of risk in your lineup? It's just an interesting approach, because I imagine we'll see somewhere close to 90-95% Russ Wilson in these lineups despite his high price. Chris Carson next. Once again, game script dependent guy, or not dependent, but game script beneficiary more than likely. Kirk Cousins, Dalvin Cook, Tyler Lockett, Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson, and then we kind of get down to Alexander Madison before we get to DK Metcalf. So again, Metcalf just probably a guy I'm staying away from. Could absolutely break this slate wide open. no doubt about it. Huge ceiling, and perhaps that's not quite reflected enough in this, but I think overall, I think the pricing is just going to be a big reason for us to focus on trying to, incentivize getting those running backs, those two quarterbacks, into our lineup along with Tyler Lockett, and then we're going to have to get creative with some cheap options, which we've already talked about. So that's the information we need. We're looking at a really cool game. I think that it's going to be a tough game to leave a ton of salary on the table. There's just a lot of really expensive options that do project for a lot of consistent target volume and rush attempt volume. It'll be tough to get really different on this slate, I think, but a little bit of creativity, things like not including Russ Wilson, things like not including, maybe even Dalvin Cook or Chris Carson, lineups like that, mixing in defenses, mixing in kickers, can be a really interesting way. Again, those cheap guys that we're really interested in, Swain, we're interested in Will Dissly a little bit. We're interested in some of those really cheap guys on the Minnesota side. We can perhaps make a little bit of advantage in that type of way. So overall, a lot of different ways to approach this slate. It's going to be tough to get unique, tough to get creative, but that's what we're here to do. Hopefully you got the ideas necessary to help you the rest of the way. Reminder to leave a rating and review. Give us the thumbs up on YouTube. Click subscribe. That would really help so much, guys. And we'll see you here on Monday over on the Maya Media Network for the Monday Night Show. See ya.